Okay, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on wherever you are. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of Asian Population Association's new seminar series on dialogues on Asia's demographic future. This series indeed reflects APA's mission to provide an open, rigorous, and forward-looking dialogues where scholars, policymakers, and practitioners can come together to examine demographic transformation shaping Asia. And more importantly, what this transformation meant for our societies, our economies, and for our future. I think that's the purpose of this seminar. And it's fitting that the inaugural seminar, we begin with a topic that lies at the heart of the current demographic debates, shrinking decline or striking decline in the fertility across post-transitional societies. This trend is no longer limited to a few countries. It has become widespread and deeply consequential in all parts of the world, including Asia. And understanding why this is happening and what it meant for the future, and all of us are very relevant and for an engaged policy dialogue. And indeed, we are truly honored today to have with us one of the world's leading scholars on fertility and demographic change, Dr. Tomas Sobotka. Thomas, thank you for accepting our invitation and giving this talk at the inaugural session. As all of you know, Dr. Thomas is the Deputy Director of the Vienna Institute of Demography and the group leader at the Fertility and Population Change under the Austrian Academy of Sciences. He is also one of the directors of the Wittgenstein Center, and he is a globally recognized authority on low fertility, family change, demographic trends in Europe and beyond. His work has indeed shaped international conversations about delayed parenthood, fertility preferences, and societal and economic contexts that influence reproductive behavior. Many of us know his influential contribution on various fields, including on human fertility database, his extensive publications, and his leadership in various comparative fertility research. And so, because I don't really want to go much deeper into that. And today, Dr. Thomas will be speaking on fewer births, fewer plans, unpacking the recent fertility declines in post-transitional societies. I'm delighted that he is opening this new APA series with a lecture that promises to spark thoughtful discussion and deepen our understanding of the trends that will influence our region as well as the regions of the many regions of the world. So, on behalf of the Asian Population Association, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thomas as well as all of you for joining this important conversation. And allow me to really welcome Dr. Thomas and all of you to this seminar. The session will be organized like this. We will have around 40 to 40 minutes talk by Dr. Thomas, followed by discussion. And any of you can really unmute and ask questions. So till then, please keep you muted. And in case you would like to use the chat box, please feel free to use chat box. I will also look at if there are any questions at the chat box for Thomas to answer. So over to you, Thomas. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James, for this introduction and for very nice words. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this webinar. What I will try to do in the next 40-45 minutes is to give you a picture what's going on with fertility rates in low fertility countries and very low fertility countries, and what is the current evidence and explanations about the drivers of these fertility changes, and then I will conclude with some thoughts about what could we say about the future. I'm trying to move my slides now. Yes. So this is a picture which will not surprise any of you. This is already what James mentioned, that there is a broad global convergence towards low fertility rates, essentially sub-replacement fertility rates in almost all world regions, with a big main exception of sub-Saharan Africa so far. But when we zoom in at this picture and look at the last 40 years, we see that there has been a lot of things happening also on the extreme low part of the fertility spectrum. And the most consequential shift has been the steep fall in fertility rates towards extreme low levels in East Asian countries, which I will comment on later on. But besides and next to East Asia, quite a number of countries with low fertility rates have experienced sudden and steep fertility declines towards yet lower fertility rates. So this is not just a phenomenon which has happened in places like China or Korea. Here in this picture, you can also see the same trend happening in Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, and at a somewhat fertility level, Turkey. So sometimes countries experience a seeming stabilization of their fertility rates at some level, and then suddenly at a low level, and then suddenly at some point, fertility rates start dropping again abruptly and rapidly to much lower levels. This is what happened in many places in the last 10, 15 years, and the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated this trend in a number of countries. Now, zooming in on East Asia, this is probably a picture familiar to many of you. East Asia is clearly now has become a hotspot of extreme low fertility rates, which is breaking all kinds of records of how low fertility can go. And again, the most surprising thing is not fertility decline per se, but it is the fact that sometimes fertility starts declining rapidly, even at extreme low levels. This is also the case of China, where you might have seen the headlines recently that the numbers of births in China last year plunged, according to the official statistics, by 17%. And this is at a situation when Chinese total fertility rate was about 1.0 in 1993, 1994. This exceptional situation of some East Asian countries and regions is also more apparent when we compare East Asia with the European Union. In this picture, European Union has had sub-replacement, low and sometimes very low fertility rates over the last 4 decades or maybe half a century. But at the same time, despite recent declines and the concerns and worries of many Europeans about their low fertility rates, you see that the situation is much more stable when compared with many East Asian societies, which now have considerably lower and sometimes much lower fertility rates than European countries. Not surprisingly, these fertility rates are raising a lot of serious discussions and sometimes raising the alarm bells about long-term fertility trends, consequences of extreme low fertility. You know that many governments are trying to reverse the trend, and there are a lot of discussions about the drivers of fertility declines. Also among popular scientists or some of the researchers who are more active and writing popular scientific books, you see different takes on these fertility declines. Typically, the publications which are seeing fertility decline as a dramatic or worrying trend, you will see them especially with red covers. There is also sometimes a discussion that there are, of course, some good outcomes coming from low or very low fertility rates, and that low fertility doesn't just have to be a negative phenomenon. That's the book with the green cover from Vegard Scherbek. This is an outline of my agenda for the next 40 minutes or so. I will not go into details. I will start right away with discussing this new low fertility landscape. And at the start, I will focus on the evidence for Europe and North America because this is where I do most of my research, but I will later connect this evidence with East Asian countries and look at some of the similarities and differences. If you look at Europe and North America, about 15 years ago, we had a very clear bifurcation when it comes to period total fertility rates, with the US, Nordic countries, Western European countries having considerably higher fertility, I would say relatively close to the replacement level than the other European regions. And this has really motivated and spurred a lot of theories and discussions about the reasons behind this bifurcation and the arguments that maybe if you build societies with very family-friendly policies, stable economies, extensive welfare states, good gender equality, like the Nordic countries or France, fertility rates may stabilize at a higher level than in other countries. So that was a nice story 15 years ago. When you zoom into the situation today, you see how much fertility declined, especially in these higher fertility places. And you also see a broad picture of convergence in fertility rates across European regions and the US, with some regions, especially Southern Europe, still having lower fertility rates. But overall, between countries and regions, this has been a picture of convergence. And this convergence has been driven especially by steep declines in fertility rates in countries which used to have higher fertility rate. This figure shows you a ranking of countries, of high-income countries except for Israel, by their total fertility rate in 2008, and then it looks at their total fertility rate in 2018 and 2023. And you see how fertility rates dropped across the board in each and every of these societies, sometimes very steeply, like in Finland, from 1.8 to 1.2, sometimes less steeply, like in France. But all of these societies, which used to have a TFR around 1.8 to 2.2, are now ranging with their TFRs around 1.5, 1.6. This is really a huge shift if we compare it with the past. And then more recently, we had the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really created a lot of waves and fluctuations in period fertility rates. Not the same in each and every country, but these changes were, were often happening abruptly and from one month to another. That's why together with my colleagues, we have set up a database which tries to monitor monthly numbers of births across selected low fertility countries. And we also provide estimates of monthly total fertility rates, because the experience of the COVID-19 showed us that monitoring fertility trends on an annual basis is not sufficient to understand these ups and downs due to external shocks and structural factors in fertility rates. And as you can see here in this figure summarizing trends for the European Union, there has been downs as well as ups during the COVID-19 pandemic. First, relatively steep decline at the start of the pandemic. Of course, we are looking here at births at the end of 2020 and the start of 2021, because these conceptions were taking place around the spring of 2020 at the start of the COVID pandemic. But then things stabilized, and in many countries, fertility rates even increased because of massive interventions of governments to support the economy and support people staying at home and working from home. And then suddenly things turned negative again and fertility rates started dropping in many places. This is an illustration of these trends using monthly estimates of fertility rates from our database for 4 countries with different fertility trajectories. Besides showing very different fertility downs and ups during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you see clearly even some upturns in, for instance, Czechia and Finland. The interesting thing is that COVID somehow changed long-term fertility trends in many places. In Czechia, for instance, the pre-COVID fertility rates were stable. After the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a steep fall in fertility rates, which continues until last year. Another example of a downward shift in fertility is in Japan, but this is where things were more or less continuing from the pre-COVID trend, whereas in Finland, where fertility rates were declining, although gradually before COVID, they broadly stabilized after the COVID short-term upturn in fertility rates. So it's interesting that we have both differences between countries, but often also accelerating shifts in fertility rates. So this is a summary of these trends so far. I will not read through this summary, just to mention that many countries are now hitting record low fertility levels, and that includes many countries in Latin America, which is a surprisingly under-researched region as far as fertility trends are concerned. And we are reaching new record lows, and it's unclear how low can fertility go in many places because we have no clear theoretical or empirical floor to fertility declines. So can we go a little bit deeper into understanding these fertility shifts? Now I will look at some of the layers of fertility decline from the demographic viewpoint, which help us understanding what's going on with fertility rates. The trend number one I would like to mention and highlight is the continuing shift towards delayed parenthood. With different speed and some accelerations and decelerations, the high-income countries and increasingly also middle-income countries have been experiencing a continuous shift towards ever later start of parenthood. Of course, there are some factors which are very closely and clearly associated with that. Increased level of education, increased enrollment in university education, increased aspirations of people, what they want to achieve in their lives, but also economic insecurities are all driving these trends. It's one of the most remarkably stable trends in fertility in the last half a century. And you see that some countries are progressing with that faster than the others. And here, South Korea is highlighted as a place with probably the latest first birth timing today among the low fertility, high income countries. South Korean women are now almost 33 years old when they have their first child. And when you think about the window, reproductive window, and when you think about a rapid rise in fertility in mid to late 30s among women, you can also think about the possible consequences of this trend continuing farther in the future. Another big trend we have seen in many countries, but now we are moving to a different set of countries, is a collapse of early fertility rates. Many of the higher income countries, which used to have elevated, and middle income countries, which used to have elevated fertility rates among teenagers and young adult women, especially with lower education, have experienced remarkable drops in these early fertility rates during the last 15 years. And the richer Latin American countries are all on this bandwagon, and as you can see in this figure, and show how remarkable was this reorganizing, reshaping in the age schedule of childbearing, marked by a collapse of early fertility rates in the region. Of course, the question mark is whether a similar trend can happen in other middle-income countries as they get richer. We don't know yet. Now, moving to European countries which already have relatively delayed childbearing, another trend which also partly explains why fertility rates were dropping in most of them during the 2010s is the ending of the previous shift towards higher fertility rates at older childbearing ages. What we have seen until about 2010, until the time of the Great Recession, is that fertility rates typically continue dropping among younger women and among women in their 20s. As you can see on this example of Finland, although these drops were relatively mild, and fertility rates were increasing among women in their 30s. So much of the shift in childbearing behavior was not the shift in family size, but was more a shift towards delayed childbearing, which of course negatively impacted period fertility rates, simple effect. But from a cohort perspective, it was just a huge reorganization of fertility schedule towards later childbearing. And in many countries, this trend of decline in early fertility and recovery of fertility at higher ages was going on from the 1980s, 1990s to about 2010. But now when you look at Finland in the last 15 years, you see that this mechanism has somehow broke. The decline in fertility rates continued and even accelerated at younger ages, but there was no recovery at ages over 30. It was actually to the contrary, that even women in their early and mid-30s experienced continuous drops in fertility rates. So the mechanism of fertility postponement or decline at younger ages and recovery increase at older ages, older reproductive ages, has somehow come to a standstill. And this is not just an evidence for Finland. We see a similar trend, although with a different level of magnitude and still some recovery at older ages. We see a similar trend in the US and many other high-income countries. Now, you may also ask whether the fertility decline of the last 15 years was mostly driven by first or higher order births. Here you see a picture based on total fertility rates, essentially decomposing the fertility decline in the 2010s into different TFR components. And you see that in almost every country, it was all birth orders which participated or which were at least partly driving this fertility decline. With a prominent role of first births, but this is relatively expected because first births consist or first births account for about 40 to 50% of all births in low fertility countries. So when we look at it from a relative standpoint, from the point of view of relative decline in total fertility rates by birth orders, we don't see consistent differences between the pace of decline between first, second, and third and higher order births between countries. We see some country-specific patterns. For instance, in South Korea, the decline was much stronger in higher order births, whereas, for instance, in Belgium and Norway and Sweden, first birth decline was more prominent than the decline in higher order births. But there is one cannot pinpoint one specific birth order which would be driving this fertility decline. Nevertheless, when we go more in detail, and this is an illustration for Finland, and look at parity-specific probabilities of having another child for women of different ages, we see that a lot of shifts have been actually driven by declining probabilities of having first births and the ongoing shift in first birth schedule towards later ages without a clear recovery. So it was mostly driven by declining likelihood of having a first child below the age of 34, 35, and then stable first birth probabilities after these ages. We see also declines in second and third birth probabilities until 2020, and then a stabilization in those probabilities, which possibly pinpoint to a future stabilization or maybe even an increase in fertility rate. Another piece of evidence based on fertility rates for different countries is that social status differences in fertility rates typically declined since the Great Recession. The social groups which used to have higher fertility rates, such as lower educated women, migrant women, and ethnic minorities, typically had faster fertility declines in most countries than the other population groups. For instance, in the US, migrants and Hispanics, which used to have much higher fertility rates than the other groups, experienced the sharpest fertility decline in the 2010s, as you can also see in this picture of fertility rates by race. There has been a lot of discussion about possible reversals of the negative gradient of fertility by education. And a lot of these discussions has been driven by the evidence for the Nordic countries, where indeed higher educated women now have the same or even slightly higher fertility rates than low educated women. But we don't see a similar evidence in many other places. This is a picture for one of the lowest fertility countries in Europe, for Spain, reconstructing total fertility rates by education attainment in 2010s, and you don't see any shift in the education gradient. At the end of this decade or this analytical period in 2017, lower educated women still had considerably higher fertility rates than higher educated women whose TFR was below 1 during that period, which also again points out to a possible future in countries where highly educated women have persistently low or extreme low fertility rates. It is difficult to expect that fertility may increase a lot in the future because this is a group, of course, which is still gaining in relative terms due to high share of people now achieving a high education attainment or tertiary education attainment. Another thing which we shouldn't forget is that this continuing postponement of childbearing in many places still keeps affecting period total fertility rates. So these extreme low period TFRs we see in many places do not provide a picture of how low the completed cohort fertility rate of these women will be at the end of the day. But and we have been estimating tempo adjusted period index of period fertility, which tries to account for the pace of fertility postponement in different countries. The one story which I would like to highlight in a nutshell is that although tempo effects are still very relevant and we see a continuing importance of tempo distortions for pushing the TFRs down, there are country-specific differences when we look at the last 15 years. In some places where total fertility rates increased during the 2010s, the tempo-adjusted fertility didn't increase. That was the case of Hungary, for instance, where government implemented a lot of pronatalist policies. So it seems that these policies affected the timing of childbearing, but not the ultimate quantum of fertility. In other places, the tempo-adjusted index of fertility declined in parallel with the period TFR, so the tempo effect remained broadly the same. And in yet other places, that was the case of Norway, and in yet other places, like in the Netherlands, tempo-adjusted fertility remained broadly stable, whereas the conventional TFR declined, pointing at rising tempo effect negatively affecting period TFR. So this is a picture of the estimated tempo effect and level change in different countries during the 2010s and their impact on the period total fertility rates in the 2010s. And we see in most countries a mixture of both. One important exception is North Korea, as well as the United States, where surprisingly, this analysis suggests that most of fertility decline, almost all of it in the last 15 years, was driven by a genuine shift towards lower fertility rates and not by an accelerated postponement of childbearing. Here is a summary of these messages from this analytical part. Again, I will not read them because I want to move on to the next evidence. And one piece of evidence which I would like to highlight and which is very relevant also for Asian, especially East Asian societies, is the rising share of women who remain childless in late reproductive ages. This is a picture showing the share of women who are childless at age 35, around 1990, and more recently around 2022. And we see increase across all societies with huge differences. In some places like Spain and Japan, and I think the same evidence pertains today to Taiwan and Hong Kong, and in the near future also to South Korea, about 4 out of 10 women are childless at the age of 35. For some of them, it's planned or intended childlessness, but many of them still plan to have a child in the future, as we know from different surveys. And we know that for many of them, it may be difficult, despite the availability of assisted reproduction, to achieve their reproductive goals. So this would be another factor which may be breaking or putting a brake on future fertility recovery, the fact that many people are now starting so late that they will not be able to realize their fertility plans. And this is something which was also coming up from a research Eva Bourgeois, I and several colleagues did with Australian data, where we found with surveys looking at fertility intentions and their realizations across different waves, so following the same women over time, that especially women planning to have a child after the age of 35 were unlikely to realize their fertility intentions and were increasingly giving up on their fertility intentions in the next survey. The evidence was much weaker in that direction for men. Now let me move on to some of the drivers of these fertility trends. What do we know and what can we summarize from the evidence by now? And since many of us are demographers, I like to start with what Bongartz calls proximate determinants of fertility. Let me start from the curious end. There has been a lot of discussion that younger people today, but also maybe also middle generations today, have less sex than people 10, 20, 30 years ago. You see some headlines from the media. And when you look at the evidence, I will not go into details here. Actually, the evidence seems to suggest that people's sexual behavior is changing. And this also concerns teenagers and young adults who have less frequent sexual intercourse and are sometimes starting later with their sexual lives and expressions than the previous generations. Of course, you may say this doesn't have much to do with fertility rates because we have perfectly efficient contraception available. This brings me to the next evidence that actually countries which used to have a lot of unplanned pregnancies and unplanned births have sometimes seen a shift towards lower proportion of unplanned pregnancies and births. One piece of evidence, again, refers to the Latin American countries, where the availability of emergency contraception and better access to reliable, long-lasting contraception, such as in this case of Uruguay, has explained a part of the collapse of teenage and young adults' fertility rates, and of course has reduced unplanned and unwanted births. Also in the US, we have some evidence that there has been a change in towards lower share of unintended births during the 2010s. So maybe part of the fertility decline is because people have a better control over their fertility rate. And then we have an evidence that young people take longer to start with not only sexual intimate relations, but to start dating relationships and to start partnerships. This evidence is especially strong for East Asian countries, where, of course, the shares of women and men who are married in their 20s and early 30s has been dropping continuously, but also the reported share of single unmarried people who have a dating partner or who have a friend of the opposite sex has been declining over time, as we see, for instance, from these continuous surveys in Japan among young adults over time. Now, moving to China, this is a place with extremely low fertility rates today, and the evidence for China also shows an acceleration of the shift towards delayed marriage. So arguably, a considerable part of the declining fertility rates, or at least a part of the declining fertility rates in China, is because young people today wait much longer until they marry. And of course, marriage is a precondition almost for everyone in East Asia for parenthood, so almost no one has children outside marriage yet. Even in European countries, we see that the fact that people are entering marriage later, entering partnerships and cohabitations later has accounted for some part of fertility decline, as evidence, for instance, for Finland in this article. I'm just mentioning this without having any strong view on that. There are also arguments that some of the fertility declines may be caused by deteriorating male reproductive health and worsening sperm parameters, but I haven't seen a consistent evidence which would translate this, for instance, to the rise of reported infertility rates by age in different countries. Now, let me shift to another package of evidence, which is also, I think, interesting and very interesting for discussion. This is the evidence about shifting reproductive preferences. Until recently, we have been used to the fact that when you ask young people across low fertility countries, how many kids would they like to have, what's their ideal family size, on average, 6 out of 10 would say 2. And this focus on having 2, sometimes 3 children was very strong. Answers of intentions of having 0 or 1 were not so common. This evidence is shifting over time, even in relatively high fertility France. We see an evidence that more recent survey from 2024 has shown a decline in reproductive ideals and intentions across different generations. I will not go into detail to this figure. You can read the article, which is listed here. In China, we have seen decline in the ideal number of children and intended number of children reported among younger women over time towards very low levels. I would say one of the lowest levels we see among low fertility countries. In the US, we see more younger people saying they intend to remain childless. And in this example of Austria, which is also typical of many other low fertility countries, many young people say, both men and women, we are unsure whether we want to have children in the future. Many say probably yes, but many also say they are unsure. That means they keep the future options open, and that means we cannot count on their fertility aspirations staying close to 2 children as in the previous generations. They are much more situational and open to remain child-free or childless in the future than the past generations. In East Asian countries where marriage is closely linked to fertility rates, like in Korea, we saw also relatively strong declines in the share of women reporting that they intend to marry in the future, and more of them being uncertain or not intending to marry. And we see that across low fertility world, more of the younger respondents are saying that parenthood is difficult, it brings difficult responsibilities and limits one's freedom, even in countries with very strong family policies like Norway in this picture. Now let me move to the last broader groups of factors which shouldn't be overlooked, drivers of fertility decline. And these are the structural factors such as economic uncertainty, housing, and the cost of living. The evidence for the United States, not very recent, but still very important, shows us that the more expensive housing prices in metropolitan areas were related to much later start of parenthood, and this pertained to different groups of women within each education category. More expensive housing means later start of parenthood. So unaffordable housing has been in the flashlight of many media discussions of the reasons behind dropping fertility rates. This is an example of OECD countries and Norway, where housing prices increased quite a lot during the 2010s. In line with that is also the evidence that in many places after the Great Recession, in the decades since the Great Recession, the incomes of young adult people have stagnated or declined. This was the case, for instance, in Europe, in Southern European countries, but also in the Nordic countries. And as you see from the next picture, this is based on the analysis of 27 European countries, countries which where income stagnated were in this simulation based on the regression model experiencing much steeper declines in fertility during the 2010s than countries which experienced modest or substantial increases in income. So stagnation of income is one of the possible explanations of declining fertility. And moving to the most recent period of the COVID-19 pandemic, the research I've done with my colleagues at the Vienna Institute of Demography showed that rising inflation in the later stage of the COVID pandemic, especially around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and rising oil prices, but also the period of the vaccination were associated with declining fertility rates. So again, we have another structural factor, rising inflation, and of course, uncertainty about the future, potentially putting a brake on fertility rates. This brings me to a broad discussion around the future expectations. There is quite a lot of demographic literature now which suggests that it's not only the economic conditions, the somehow objective economic conditions of today, like unemployment rates or inflations, but it's especially the expectations about the future, which makes many younger people hesitant about deciding to have children. And there is some empirical evidence linking this to lower fertility rates. Globally, we are now living in a period when incredibly high number of people say that future generations will be financially worse off financially than the current generations. And this is reaching up to 70 to 80% people in many low fertility, high income countries, including the US and France. And of course, these very negative future expectations are again translating to the hesitation of many people about having children. I will skip the last block of evidence about East Asian countries because many of you are better experts on East Asia than I am. I would just perhaps like to emphasize that East Asian countries are experiencing the same structural conditions and structural breaks on fertility rates as Europe or North America. But on the top of that, they have their specific East Asian or Asian specific factors, such as the close connection of marriage and reproduction, very steep price of education for parents with extracurricular activities, which is extremely high, extremely costly, especially in Korea, and also higher levels of gender inequality, which are all potential factors putting a brake on fertility rates and explaining why fertility in East Asia is even lower than in Europe. Now, moving on to the discussion about what did we learn from this evidence and what does it bring for the future, I think the important take-home point is there is no single explanation, not a single set of drivers that would, in a satisfying way, account for the falling fertility rate of the last 15 years. I try to show that it's a combination of structural constraints, but also changing reproductive preferences, changing partnership behaviors, external shocks, including the recent COVID pandemic, more efficient contraception in many places, but also negative future expectations, which are driving both fertility declines and continuing delays of childbearing. These are some of the take-home messages from this evidence. There are a lot of economic and labor market pressures on young generations and young adults. So this is a group of people where we should focus more on understanding their conditions and aspirations in lives. I would also like to highlight that there are discussions about the new standards of parenthood. With young people maybe having higher bars about what does it take to be a good parent and being more hesitant as a result to enter parenthood. There are nice discussions of that, for instance, from Anna Rothkirch, which is also linking these changes in behavior to the influence of the digital media, where in the digital era, it's not such a cool thing to have kids because the perception of parenthood is that it brings sacrifice, it's perceived as a burden, it's not much fun to have children, and that also may kind of decrease the motivation of younger people to have children. Maybe the last take-home message I would like to emphasize is that 15, 20 years ago, we had a lot of contributions about possible reversals between economic development, gender equality, and fertility rates, suggesting that at high levels of economic development and high level of gender equality, fertility rates will turn upwards, people will recuperate their postponed childbearing, and these countries will have higher fertility rates, with the Nordic countries being prime examples of that U-shaped pattern. After the fertility drops of the last 15 years, this doesn't hold anymore because we cannot reconstruct such a U-shaped relationship, at least not on the basis of period fertility rates of the last years and periods. So we are living in a new era of low fertility rates, low reproduction, where higher reproductive preferences cannot be taken for granted anymore in the low fertility countries. And this also limits the abilities of governments to address fertility rates, because the usual story that we only need good policies to help people realize their fertility intentions is less clear-cut now, and the intentions are more situational and lower than they were before. We clearly see the emergence of extreme low fertility rates with the TFR around 1 or below during crises, such as the COVID pandemic, and in societies with lasting institutional barriers to higher fertility rates. A question for the future is whether the medically assisted reproduction can partly offset the negative impact of postponed childbearing on fertility rates, but I keep this discussion maybe for later. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Actually, it has been a fascinating global fertility scenario. The demographic factors which we have really considered earlier, decline in the adolescent fertility and postponement and inequity within across different ethnicity group and race, all those things have substantially declined. But at the same time, we also see a plunge in the global overall decline in the fertility. You have really looked at both demographic factors, the economic factors, and other explanations. It's really fascinating, but we are unable to come to any single possible forces that are shaping currently the global fertility. I think that's where we really need more research, more discussion, and more debates on this. So let us open it for some comments and your suggestions and questions, and then we will see how to move forward on the global fertility scenario. I'm sure you may have some opinions because these are really currently very hotly contested topics. So naturally, it is good to have your own perspective also being told during your conversation. So please feel free to unmute in case you need me to call the name based on the, if we can really show any signs, that's also fine. Otherwise, please feel free to unmute and ask questions.
I'm Saidunisa here. Can I ask?
Please go
Yeah.
ahead. Say.
Yeah. Basically, when you have talked about postponement of first birth or second birth, it is important. But when people are having only 1 or 2 children, that postponement will not play much role. But if they postpone it beyond 35, then there is a problem. What we are seeing in South Asian countries is that we do not have IVF facility free of cost. Although it is available, but it is very costly. And at that time, it will not be possible for them to have children. For many of them, will not be possible to have. And why people are postponing it? Many of them have reported that it is the cost of living and uncertainty of economic this thing. And many of them are working in the educated persons, but they are working in informal type of jobs, contractual jobs. So they are hesitant to go for childbirth before 35 also. And after 35, they are facing the problem. So we need to think about this in South Asian countries, in the context of South Asian countries where fertility services are not much available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thomas, we can take a couple of questions together and answer.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sure. I see Jalal has raised his hands. Jalal, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thomas, thank you for the excellent and comprehensive presentation. And I think that we needed a workshop to absorb all the points that you mentioned. In several places in your presentation, you mentioned the decline of unintended pregnancy has led to the decline of fertility. And then you again highlighted the importance of emergency contraception and better control over fertility. Some maybe pronatalist advocates and policymakers thought that if we reduce access to contraception, they may lead to higher fertility, like in Romania and other places. Does it mean that if we reduce access to contraception or regulate it, it lead to higher fertility? And if we do so, what about the reproductive rights of women? Thank you.
Okay, I have not seen any other hands. Maybe Thomas, you can answer by that time.
Yes, so thank you. I start with the first comment on delayed parenthood. There have been a lot of messages in these comments. So one thing is, of course, what does it mean in societies where people aspire to have one or two children only? Would access to IVF solve their situation and address infertility increase among people in their late 30s? And the evidence is that only partly, because IVF access is important to have for all couples who are suffering with infertility. But at the same time, for many couples who start late, who start their pregnancy attempts in their late 30s, the in vitro fertilization with the use of their own gametes, especially women's own oocytes, shows rapidly declining rates of success and much higher rates of miscarriages after 40. And the one successful way of dealing with that is receiving eggs, oocytes, from another woman who is younger, or using egg freezing at younger ages and using these eggs at older reproductive ages. But so far, this is quite expensive. It's tricky in some countries. Oocyte donation, egg donation is not very simple. And we don't see very high numbers of women getting pregnant and having babies in this way. It's increasing rapidly, but it's not a very mainstream way of having children. You also mentioned different drivers of fertility postponement. You were right about the economic constraints. There are also discussions about uncertainty competition. But the interesting set of drivers is that many women in their 30s are saying they cannot find a good partner with whom they would like to have children, at least in Europe. This is the situation, I think, in Japan and Korea probably as well. The expectations of women are not met by the education, income, or the other characteristics and properties of their prospective partners. What happens at the end of the day that many highly educated women remain without a partner and childless, and many lower educated men cannot find a partner as well because they just don't meet the aspirations and expectations of their prospective female partners, who are now often more educated than men in many rich countries. To Jalal, the question, I think there is no question for any of us demographers advocating restricting access to contraception to anyone, especially not to teenagers. This decline in early teenage fertility and young adult fertility rates happened in countries not only which used to have a lot of unplanned pregnancies, but also in situations when you wouldn't want people to have children, not having a proper partner, not completing their education. You don't want, as any government, you don't want to create a small baby boom with teenage girls in education and without a partner becoming pregnant and having a baby. This is not a recipe for sustainable fertility increase. These are not family conditions where you would like the future children to be raised and educated. So I think it's a clear no towards a suggestion that one should consider, or one can consider, limiting contraception. It wouldn't bring big change in birth or fertility rates, but it would bring a lot of unhappy families and unhappy children.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? There is one in the chat box which was asking the question whether we need to really give more emphasis to cohort fertility now other than period fertility measures, because the period fertility measures appears to be a bit misleading.
Mm-hmm.
What's your view on that?
Yes, definitely. Yes, big yes on that. I almost want to apologize that I didn't bring more cohort fertility measures. That was a pragmatic decision. First, because the recent crises like the COVID-19 pandemic cannot be yet illustrated with their impact on cohort fertility. These women affected by these shocks are not yet reaching the end of their reproductive lives. But also, I didn't have more time to go into how cohort fertility is changing across ages. But we still see, despite the picture of, for instance, European-wide convergence in period fertility rates, we still see huge differences in Europe between the cohort fertility rates. In the Nordic Western European countries, they remain considerably higher than in Southern and Central Europe. And yes, definitely we need to look much more at cohort fertility rates. And that also includes studying much more the parity distributions, parity specific behavior, because childlessness is becoming a big driver, if you want, or a big part of the low fertility story in many countries. I can mention again Japan, with about 30% of women remaining permanently childless, or 28 to 30% of women. So even if all the women with children have on average 2 children per woman, the very high childlessness rates is simply driving Japanese cohort fertility rates to much, much lower levels.
Thank you. I see 2 hands now. Go ahead, Kamal Khan. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. You can just unmute and please ask questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Sobotka, for very interesting presentation. My question is about the pro-natalist policies. Can you maybe briefly highlight what would be these most common pro-natalist policies? One aspect I wanted to ask, this one-time big support versus long-term support by the government, like providing subsidized or maybe free childcare facilities versus this big one-time cash, which, as I understand, was practiced by some countries. And then the effect, whether they brought any measurable, sustained results. And probably the third part would go beyond demography, the economic sustainability of such policies. Thank you.
We have Vasanna, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas. This really excellent presentation. I really enjoy learning a lot of this evidence. My question is related to some small countries that we work in this region, including like the Maldives and Jarrah. You may be aware of the case that I'm talking about, and small island countries in which they have like 500 population. But yet we found the phenomena that in the past 2 decades, TFR in Maldives is declining 1.7, yeah. But also CPR is declining in the past 2 decades to really low. It's lowest in the region, really, about 14, 15%. And unmet need of family planning is also almost 1/3. And satisfaction of family planning method is also low, yeah, about 30%. And we discussed and thought that it might be according to the abortion that we probably do not have the evidence. Plus also the country that 1/3 of the population, they are migrants and most of them are men, yeah. And also we have found that in the Pacific countries, many small population countries also have, can the situation on fertility can be fluctuated very quickly, and also because they have migration. So I would like to hear some view from you on that. Thank you.
Maybe we will take one more by Long Wong. Please unmute that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Laura Warner. I'm not from Asia, from Latin America. And Thomas, thank you very much for all the evidence here. But my conclusion after hearing is that there is a lot of circumstances, elements, structural things that are conditioning the fertility to fall, definitely. And it is the case from Asia. It was the case for Europe, and I think it's also the case from Latin America. I mean, there is a lot of evidence that saying that women or couples simply don't want to have children because they cannot afford, because they don't want, because of the modernization. So I think that one of the main points to consider is, well, we need to administrate this situation. I don't think any strong policies to change, because that's going to be against our reproductive rights. And that's my concern with Jalal. Anything to promote higher fertility, it has to probably going to clash our reproductive rights. Thank you very much.
Yeah, please go ahead, Thomas.
How much time do you give me to respond?
Yeah, you can take time. We have still another 10 minutes.
I try to be relatively brief, but it's tricky because the questions were going in all directions. So let me start with policies and their impact. That was the question from Kamal Khan. And of course, I would need another seminar to have a proper discussion of that. But the message in a nutshell is that simple pronatalist policies, which are often based on financial incentives, which try to incentivize people with baby bonuses or cash benefits to have more children, have failed, at least in higher income countries, because the costs of children are so much higher that you cannot offset that with a one-off baby bonus of 2,000 or 3,000 euros or dollars, or with a financial benefit like Poland did, 100 euros per month per child, later increased a little bit. So this sometimes creates a short-term, 1 year, 2 years, small, I wouldn't call it baby boom, small uptick in the number of births, but fails in the long-term perspective. The picture is a little bit less clear-cut for some other policies which are really taking into account the concerns of couples, like establishing very flexible and well-paid parental leave, establishing very good childcare availability, high-quality childcare which is subsidized, that could have some positive impact in the long term, but we are not talking about replacement level fertility. We are not talking about turning the tide of declining fertility into an increase of fertility. We are more talking about stabilization of fertility rates at moderately low level and preventing a decline of fertility towards extremes like we have seen in Korea. As far as the comment by Vasana about small population Iceland countries, well, I think there is a story to tell about every single country. For Maldives, there is just one comment or two comments which I can think of, that 1.7 is not a tragic low level of fertility. That's a new normal, I would say. Not a big reason for concern unless Maldives has a lot of outmigration, because migration, both immigration and outmigration, are now often affecting population trends even more than fertility rates in many small countries. And with respect to contraceptive prevalence, we see in many high-income countries actually that somehow may align with the situation in Maldives, that some people are hesitating taking the pill or taking hormonal contraception. So we see a kind of voluntary increase in the use of traditional contraceptive methods, especially withdrawal. And this is not because people wouldn't have access. I mean, in high-income countries, I'm not talking about Maldives now. In places like Czechia, it is not because people wouldn't have access to modern contraception, but it's the preference of some of the people, for instance, not to use the pill and use condoms or use withdrawal instead. So the traditional or more primitive contraceptive methods are not completely dead, and it doesn't have to mean unmet need for all the populations concerned. For Laura, I think the one key message is very clear, and I fully agree with you. If you are a projection maker thinking about middle income countries like Latin America, the very likely future trend in the next 2 decades is for fertility to decline further, to expect a lot of surprises about record low levels in many places like Brazil and Argentina and many other countries experiencing new record lows, partly because Latin America is now at the start of this postponement transition to delayed parenthood. So both the shift towards much later parenthood, more efficient contraceptive use, and changing reproductive preferences towards fewer kids, more women becoming educated and having other aspirations than spending their reproductive lives with small kids will mean that possibly places like Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina are just ahead of several decades of very, very low fertility rates. That would be, I mean, I'm not sure I would put many hundreds of dollars of a bet on the table, but I would put $100 bet on the table for that if I were a projection maker. And the governments cannot really do too much to change the situation substantially. They can improve it at the margins. Policies are very important because we have people everywhere who cannot realize their fertility preferences because of economic constraints. That's clear. But so this can be partly addressed, but it doesn't change radically the big picture of fertility decline in many places.
Okay, Thomas, we have a couple of questions from the chat box. I think there we will end because we are almost reaching the time, 75 minutes. So one was on one of the concerns that comes along the postponement of childbirth is rising prevalence of lifestyle diseases like PCOS and hormonal imbalances, which often starts early, but later creates issues of conception. That was one question. And the second one was, does the growing burden on sandwich generation couples in aging societies hinder the ability to sustain current fertility levels? I believe there is one or yes. No, these are the two, and then we will really wind up.
Yes, thank you. So I don't have much to comment on the impact of postponement. Yes, there are more hormonal imbalances and there is a rise in fertility. This with a big simplification. 35 is taken often as an age when infertility starts increasing first gradually and then after the age of 40 very rapidly. So this fact, I think the important message there is that younger generations should know these facts. So when people start thinking about having or not having babies, they should be aware of these biological limitations and difficulties for many couples to achieve pregnancy and to keep this pregnancy to term when they are in their late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s. The sandwich generation question is interesting but tricky because on the one hand, postponing childbearing means higher availability of older generations, grandparents, if grandparents are healthy. Think, for instance, of people having kids between 30 and 35. So they would become parents when they are 30 to 35, and if the same gap would be with their grandparents, the grandparents would become grandparents between 60 and 70. that's the age when people retire in Europe. So if the grandparents are healthy, they're retired, they don't need to work, they can spend some time with the kids if they like. But this, if they are healthy, is a big if. So we will have more people who are sandwiched with obligations to help caring for their grandparents and at the same time caring for their kids. But we also may have more people who have their grandparents available because their grandparents are retired and free and still healthy to take care of the kids. So I don't know where the balance lies. Maybe there are cross-country differences or generation differences. I wouldn't have a clear view of is it more people sandwiched or is it more people who can enjoy their grandparents helping along?
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And it has been really fascinating talk. And as a start for the APA series, I'm sure this has really created a lot of interesting issues and debates, especially global fertility changes are really universal now, not only for the earlier considered to be European, now it is East Asian, but it's also now coming to many other parts of the world, including South Asia and other small regions. So that way, it has been really fascinating to listen to you and look at all the important factors, policy interventions, unsuccessful policies, and also listen to many other socioeconomic determinants. Thank you so much. I think before I go, I need to really thank a few people, especially the Secretariat, who has been really instrumental in organizing this. Arisara from the Secretariat, as well as Chalam Paul, is really helpful in organizing these events. Thank you both for really all your support, as well as I think this talk has been really instrumental because of the intervention by Jalal Abbasi, the former president of the APA. Also, Jalal, thank you so much for introducing and also connecting with Thomas really to organize these events. And
Thank you very
Thomas,
much.
thank you so much for spending time for the APA. We really appreciate your time as well as agreeing to give this talk. Thank you. We hope you continue to be closely associated with the APA in the coming years. And for your information, our APA conference will be held in November 24 to 27 at Hanoi, Vietnam, and it has been already announced. The details are there in our website. Please have a look at it, and you can really submit the papers, I think, for the next couple of months, I believe. And we have also, this series will be continuing. I think the next will be in May, which will be announced very soon. So please look at our website as well as our email correspondence from the APA, which you get the details of the next talk. I hope all of you will continue to attend the APA events. And with that, thank you once again for all of you joining, and thank you, Thomas, and all of you, and have a great day ahead for those who are in the time zones, and have a good night for maybe most part of the Asia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. All
Thank
the best.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.